Thanks for checking out the LGU, where we talk to Christian academics about their work in a way that anyone can understand. Today's guest is Dr. Aubrey Buster, Associate Professor of Old Testament at Wheaton College. She focuses most of her research work on the Psalms, Chronicles, Ezra-Nehemiah, and Daniel. And today we talk about Daniel and the forthcoming commentary she co-authored with John Walton that comes out in November of this year. We cover everything from Daniel's crazy apocalyptic ending chapters to the more familiar stories like the lion's den or the fiery furnace. I learned a ton from Dr. Buster. I'm sure you will too. This is Theology U, episode 31. Dr. Aubrey Buster, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. It's good to have another Wheaton person back. It's been a little while after we had a string of Wheaton people, so
Yes.
It's good to have Wheaton represented again. And today we're talking about the book of Daniel. This morning I was doing my due diligence, scanning through the book, and I wrote down a list of all the things that we have to cover.
Okay.
We have interpreting dreams. We have Daniel being a vegetarian.
Yeah.
The fiery furnace.
Yeah.
We have Nebuchadnezzar, maybe our most famous biblical king.
Right.
Then converting and worshiping God periodically.
Okay.
And then we have the writing on the wall, Daniel writing on the wall. And then, of course, the lion's den, these terms, the Ancient of Days and the Son of Man, and then these end time prophecies.
Sure.
So we can cover all that in 45 minutes, right? No problem. We should be good.
Yeah, we managed to convince the publisher to give us 2 volumes for this commentary. So maybe it's at least a couple of podcasts, but
Great. Well, we'll see what we can do. I want to ask you first, if we kind of assume a general understanding of the book, so we don't waste too much time doing summary.
Yeah.
And if you're not familiar with it, go read it. It's not too long. You can go read the book and come back. Can you start kind of from your perspective, having written now 2 volumes of a commentary on it? Where are we? What's going on in the biblical story and historically first? Yeah. What's the background?
Yeah. So within the book of Daniel itself, it stretches from the beginning of the exile to Babylon. The most likely date for Daniel to have been brought into Babylon is probably 597. That was the first wave of exiles who were forcibly brought from Jerusalem to Babylon after Nebuchadnezzar's first siege of Jerusalem. So that's 597 BCE, which is shortly before 587, 586. That's that crucial year where Nebuchadnezzar finally defeats Jerusalem and destroys the temple. This is what's known as the Exile in biblical history, and it's one of the main turning points in the story. So it stretches from that point all the way until the reign of Cyrus. So it covers, according to the book of Daniel, 3 empires: the Babylonian Empire, then a very brief interlude with a Median king, and then finally Cyrus the Persian. Cyrus the Persian king is most well known for beginning the return from exile when he defeats the Babylonian Empire in 539 BCE. He allows some of the people who had been exiled to Babylon to return to Judea and to rebuild Jerusalem. This is the story that is narrated in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Daniel, though, is not among those that return. So you can think of Daniel's life in Babylon as spanning that first wave of exiles, 597 BCE. He's in Babylon when Jerusalem is defeated and the temple is destroyed in 587. And then at the end of Daniel 1, it says he remains in the court of the king until the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. And that's the king who allows them to return. And then the very last vision, Daniel 10 through 12, is dated to the 3rd year of Cyrus. So that's after that return has taken place and Daniel remains in Babylon. So as a whole, the whole story takes place during the period that we know of as the exile, when Jerusalem has been defeated, there is no temple standing, and the people are dispersed.
Yeah, they have been kicked out.
Yeah. Most of them. There are plenty of people who remain in the land, but they're not a political power by any means. Yeah.
Right. And so I want to start at the end, and then we'll come back to, I want to save the lion's den and things like that for the end. I want to start with perhaps the trickier stuff first, which is these end time prophecies, because it's timely. And we just talked about it on previous episodes about how does prophecy work in the Old Testament and like what's going on here, because Daniel, the book, I guess I should start. When is Daniel written? Do we have an idea when it's written down? Because it's not written down in 597.
It is not. It is not.
It's much later. So
Yeah,
do we know when it was written? And then I want to talk about the prophecies.
we have good arguments for when it's written.
Sure.
Yes. Um, And so the book of Daniel was probably written over a long period of time, like all of the Old Testament books are. We're dealing with a very different literary culture than today, for sure, where books are published and they have authors, they have copyright dates. It's very clear when things are written. If it's revised, you put like revised
Hmm.
edition, so you can compare what those changes are. I mean, it's even a different literary culture than the New Testament, which I think is something that often causes us to confuse claims to authorship in the Old and New Testament. So the book of Daniel, like essentially every Old Testament book, was written over a long period of time. The first 6 chapters, Daniel 1 through 6, we do think, my co-author, when I say we, my co-author John Walton, it's a
Hmm.
co-authored commentary. And so it's not a royal we or a divine we, it's an actual me, my co-author who wrote these arguments and developed this together. So we agree with those scholars who think there was a gradual process of development, that there is probably uh, a core of early stories contained certainly in probably Daniel 2 through 6 that preserve memories, reminiscences of tales that
Hmm.
emerged in the Babylonian court in response to exile. We see this genre called a court tale. Daniel 1 through 6 are examples of court tale. Esther is a court tale. Joseph, the story of Joseph at the end
Hmm.
of Genesis, this is a court tale. And so it's this genre of stories that narrate the exploits and travails of subjugated peoples living in the court of imperial kings. And they often, as happens in Daniel and Esther and Joseph, they often encounter difficulties brought on either by their colleagues or by the foolishness of the kings, and they need to, by their wisdom and through divine aid, overcome these obstacles. And it's basically a genre designed to show you that you can thrive in exile. It's
Hmm.
written for these subjugated peoples who don't possess any political power. They're living amongst strangers who don't always have their good in mind, and they're subject to these kings who aren't always great, right? They kind
Hmm.
of range from evil to foolish. um, and so this causes problems for them, and they're really stories that are designed to inspire those people living in that time. So Daniel 1 through 6, at least Daniel 2 through 6, Daniel 1 might have been added later, but those 6 chapters probably began to be told and retold in the late Babylonian period. So we're
Hmm.
looking maybe the early 6th century. Certainly we're told and retold across the Persian period and then into the Greek period. And like stories that are popular and that are both told orally and probably written down in different copies, they changed and developed over time. We see this definitely in chapters 4 through 6. We actually have manuscript evidence for this because we have a Greek version that's mostly shorter and has some additions and subtractions and different phrases. And the Masoretic text, which is both in Hebrew and Aramaic for 4 through 6, is particularly different. I mean, Daniel 3 has a whole set of 2 extra prayers that are added. They actually sing a song in the fire, which is kind of nice,
Hmm.
right? Don't we wish that that was in the Hebrew Aramaic version? And so we see evidence of this gradual composition process for 1 through 6. 7 through 12 are probably the latest portion of the book. Daniel 7, we argue in the commentary, is the earliest apocalyptic vision, and was probably written when the Hellenistic Empire defeated the Persian Empire and there was political turmoil after the death of Alexander the Great. And it's probably
Hmm.
an early apocalyptic vision that was written to reapply, to re envision how the truth conveyed in Daniel 2, that 4 layered statue that Nebuchadnezzar sees in his dream, how that truth, how that pattern manifests itself now that a new empire has taken over. Then Daniel 8 through 12 are reapplications, readaptations of the pattern in Daniel 7, now adapted to this period in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, when a king called Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who some historians think was verifiably insane, at least cruel, had was oppressing the Judean people. According to the Book of Maccabees, he outlawed Jewish religion. He violently quelled a rebellion in Jerusalem, and it was his cruelty that initiated the Maccabean rebellion. So
Hmm.
Daniel 7 through 12, and definitely 8 through 12, are written in light of this new form of oppression, this cruel king, who's even more violent and cruel than Nebuchadnezzar before him. And it takes this kind of beloved, heroic character, Daniel, who thrived in the Babylonian exile, and places these visions kind of in his mouth in order to convey to the second century audience that the truths that we learned before, that God is in charge of all earthly empires, still apply, even though the
Hmm.
empires have gotten worse, that the kingdom of God is still coming, even though it seems like the situation is even darker than ever before. So what we see is this kind of gradual process where divine revelation given to earlier generations of Judeans is reapplied and reinterpreted and reinstated over the centuries of imperial rule over Jerusalem.
So interesting. We're
Yes.
going to come so much there. Let's
Yeah.
start with, I said we'd start with prophecy. So
Yeah.
let's start with the verse you talked about
Okay.
with King Nebuchadnezzar
Yeah.
and the statue.
So Daniel 2 is a narrative that is set up when Nebuchadnezzar has this dream and calls all the sages of Babylon. Daniel and his friends are apparently among these sages. And he tells them to tell the dream. And they're like, sure, we can do that if you tell us what the dream is. And he says no. Scholars debate as to whether that means he actually forgot it or whether he's testing them. We have great texts from the ancient world that show how paranoid some of these kings were, that they're diviners is the term. Diviner is a term for a whole bunch of different professionals in the courts of the king whose job it was to determine divine will. So prophecy, that you've brought up a couple of times, that's one mode of divination where you determine
Sure.
divine will. But there's also dream interpretation. That's another mode of divination. There's something called extaspacy, which is the ritual sacrifice of animals, and you read their entrails. There's reading the stars. So there's all different modes of discerning divine will. And in the ancient world, this was a profession you would have. Like if you were a scholar in the ancient world, you were probably a scribe or a diviner, right? Like if I was a scholar in the court of the king, I would be a diviner, not
So
an old.
this is a career that
This is a career. You
I'm a
go to divination
career. Yeah.
school. This is probably in when it talks about Daniel being trained in the literature and language of the Chaldeans in Daniel 1, he's probably going to divination school and
Interesting.
learning all of these modes of divination. Um, the diviners say, and they're actually correct, when Nebuchadnezzar asks him to tell him the dream, that the knowledge that he's asking them to give him does not belong to humans. It belongs to God, which is actually a statement that all divination experts in the ancient world would have agreed with. And this nicely sets up Daniel to come along and to say, all right, give me a stab at this. He goes and prays to God for divine revelation, which is interesting for a couple of reasons that we'll go over. And God grants that revelation to him as a gift. Nebuchadnezzar then recognizes that this revelation is one true because he successfully tells the dream to him and its interpretation, and therefore recognizes that Daniel has a relationship with a God who reveals wisdom and truth. I maybe want to highlight a couple pieces of this that I found particularly interesting
That'd be
as
great.
I got into dream interpretation.
And just for clarity's sake,
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar has had this dream.
Yeah.
And he tells his career diviners,
That's right.
Tell me what I've dreamed.
That's right.
And they say we can't. And then Daniel successfully does, correct?
And so this is a twist.
Okay.
So usually we read this story as a kind of takedown of divination, right? Like, see, the diviners aren't real. What they do is all fake. They don't do anything real, but look, Daniel does the real thing. And I think this is an incorrect way of reading the story, because when they come along and say, what you're asking us to do, only a God can do, this is actually the basis of divination. In the ancient world, to divine a God's will required the God to share that will with you, to share it through writing on an animal's entrails or writing it in the stars or giving you a dream or giving you a prophecy. What's significant, I think, is what it meant when a God decided to give you that revelation. They
Hmm.
didn't think humans had this revelation. They thought gods had to give it to you. So in the ancient world, they believed that when a god gave you access to divine will, this was a sign of relationship with that god. It was a sign of divine favor. So basically, what the diviners are revealing is not that their whole profession is a sham, but that they do not have the necessary relationship with a god to receive that divine will, making them
Hmm.
essentially useless. And so when Daniel comes along and does, this is a sign that Daniel, it's not that Daniel's better at divination than everyone else, but it means Daniel has the kind of relationship with a god, apparently a very powerful god, where that god responds to Daniel's requests, gives him the information that he has required. And this is viewed as a sign of divine favor, which is why Nebuchadnezzar responds so intensely to Daniel. It's not because he's
Hmm.
impressed. They assumed, actually, that gods would tell you what they were going to do in the ancient world. He responds that way because he's discovered that Daniel, this guy, he hasn't necessarily treated him that great. He's been brought as an exile from Jerusalem, is actually really important. It would be like
Huh.
discovering that, like, the kid you punched in the playground is like the son of the president or something, right? You'd be like, oh wait,
Huh.
I didn't know you were so well connected. I didn't
Yeah.
know you were such an important person. And so Nebuchadnezzar honors him immensely as someone who's favored of
Could
this powerful
could
being.
we use that analogy further? Because in Nebuchadnezzar's world, there's multiple gods. There's many
Totally.
gods. So it
Totally.
would be like to say the kid that you're making fun of in
Yeah.
school is the son of the president of another country,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
It might be
sure.
like, oh, there's this god I don't even know about in
Yeah.
Nebuchadnezzar's world, right? And wow, you seem to really be, close with him.
Yes. Yes.
Okay.
And that God, though, so it would be, to play with this fun analogy even
Yeah.
more, it would be like the kid you were picking on the playground was the son of the president of someone who just took over your country and you didn't know it.
Oh,
Because God
interesting.
has said, look, the dream says you're the head of gold, but there are these layers to the statue, and there's this rock that's coming. And so this God is also claiming to be in charge of Nebuchadnezzar's empire. And that's quite important for
Hmm.
Nebuchadnezzar to know. So I think what's cool about this is it makes the story for the exiles in Jerusalem not a story that the Babylonian gods aren't real or that divination is false, but for the exiles in Jerusalem, it's a story that God continues to favor them and to grant
Hmm.
them um, power and honor and worth in the eyes of Nebuchadnezzar, in the eyes of their
Yeah.
captives.
So it's not so they're not it's not even necessarily arguing against polytheism at this
No,
juncture.
nope, I don't think so at all.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's arguing for God's effective power and God's effective presence in
Yeah,
Babylon.
close relationship with Daniel.
Exactly, exactly. Which is what they
Interesting.
needed to know. Which is what they needed to know. Yeah,
Yeah. Okay, interesting. So then moving on from there, obviously Daniel continues to wow Nebuchadnezzar.
that's right.
Jumping ahead then to Daniel 7
Mhm,
through the end.
mhm,
And this whole idea of divination and prophecy. I
that's
just want to hear you talk more about it.
right. Okay.
And how is it working? And do we think Daniel is do we think Daniel is seeing the future? Do we see God
Yeah,
revealing the future to Daniel, or is it something else? I just want to hear you talk about it.
totally. So first, I'm going to make a bit of a distinction
Sure.
between prophecy and apocalyptic texts. I think a lot of the errors or misunderstandings that come from reading Daniel 7 through 12 is through misidentifying it as the genre of prophecy.
Hmm.
So 7 through 12 are the kind of clearest example of apocalyptic literature in the Old Testament. The other apocalyptic book that we have in the canon is the book of Revelation. So Daniel 7 through 12 and Revelation are the same genre. This genre has some similarities to prophecy, but it also has lots of differences. So, apocalyptic literature features largely visions, whereas in prophetic texts, we do get some visions, but the majority of prophetic texts are presented as words that are heard or spoken from God through this prophet. Apocalyptic literature is also usually mediated through a heavenly being other than God. So you'll
Hmm.
note that in Daniel 7 through 12, there are visions that just happen to Daniel. It's like these visions just stop. Daniel and the various apocalyptic visionaries in their tracks, and then they need to be interpreted by an angel. So we don't get that phrase like we get in prophetic literature, thus says the Lord.
Sure.
Da, 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 da. We get a vision. It's often heavily symbolic. It requires interpretation. Sometimes it isn't even understood. These visions largely have to do with either the patterns that are going to make up time. So this includes what we might call the future, though of course the future depends on your vantage point, and the past. So the apocalyptic visions, when they have to do with time, are really laying out the major patterns of time. So the pattern that stretches to the beginning and can be expected to continue to the end. And we also have in apocalyptic visions patterns laid out in space. These are called otherworldly journeys, where people, different visionaries, are brought up into the heavens and they see the patterns of space, the kind of
Sure.
what the heavens and the earth look like. So apocalyptic visions tend to focus on laying out, revealing these grand patterns that underlie reality. Apocalyptic visions also reveal transcendent reality, meaning something that you couldn't necessarily just discern from what's around you. They are revelation that you couldn't receive through ordinary means. Prophets are sometimes as well, but we have to remember that the prophets in the Old Testament are largely reminding Israel of what God has already told them. That's that distinction that you might be familiar with between forthtelling and foretelling, that the prophet's job is to help Israel look back to the covenant, to follow it in that time period, and then to threaten judgment in the future, and then after that judgment, hope. So there's a little bit of future prediction, but it's mostly reminding of the covenant. We don't tend to see this in apocalyptic literature. It's not saying, look what I told you before, now follow it so that these things don't happen. It's saying, look, this is the ultimate pattern of time and space. It's been specially given to you so that you understand what is to come. So these are differences. These are differences between apocalypse and prophecy, which make them different genres. And this also means that we need to read them in different ways. So if you're going to kind of sum it up,
Sure.
Its purpose is first to show you that reality is both more terrible than you think it is, true reality, more terrible than you think it is, and more glorious than you think it is. And we see this in each apocalyptic vision, that the veil gets removed and the reality that they think they're experiencing, which is just this earthly succession of empires, is actually a succession of monstrous beasts, or is actually a scene that's happening in this heavenly courtroom. So reality is both worse than you expect, that the hope, though, is greater than you might even hope for. And so this is those expressions of, the kingdom of God is going to be given to the people of the holy ones of Elyon, these great promises for the future, in which all of these beasts will be destroyed and their bodies cast into fire, and everything will be great. And so it's giving you enough hope through this vision so that you have the ability to endure in the meantime. So while the prophets demand that you look back to the law, to the covenant, and live as God's covenant people correctly so that these events don't overtake you, the apocalyptic vision often says, look, this pattern is going to continue for some time. It's even going to be worse than you think. But your hope is greater than you were previously hoping for, and this allows you to endure, to live as the wise in the meantime.
Interesting. And at this time, so I think that distinction is very helpful.
Yeah.
We're splitting up the first half of Daniel to the second half of Daniel. At this time, obviously Revelation has not been written yet.
That's
so
right.
there is no template for apocalypse or apocalyptic literature, or is there?
In the Bible.
Sure.
So sorry to interrupt. The third
because it's so chaotic. It seems like who got this idea to write this way, and where is this coming from?
I think that's really insightful, because it is, in terms of reading our Bible, we've encountered nothing like it before.
Right.
Nothing
Right.
like it before. Now, the apocalyptic literature is a genre that emerged, and people debate where it came from. There's probably international influence. There's a lot of things that happen, but it emerges in about the 3rd century BCE. So we get the books of Enoch are probably the earliest examples of the apocalyptic literature. If you date Daniel 7 through 12, a little bit later than that, as I think is convincing, um, and we get the rise of this genre in the 3rd century BCE, and then we get examples of both Jewish and Christian apocalypses written from that period of time through about the 3rd century CE. So
Mm.
it's a genre that kind of emerges and is very popular for this 600 years, and that's when we get Daniel 7 through 12 and also the book of Revelation as an example of this genre. I think
Okay.
if I could intervene in any like Christian reading practice of the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation, it would be to read these extra biblical apocalypses,
Hmm.
just because all of a sudden you see this is a genre, like it's working in a particular way, um, and it helps you see how there is a template that
Yeah.
they're following, and a template that would have helped their original audiences to read and understand and expect certain things from these revelations. So we
Yeah.
often read it as we've read a bunch of prophets, and then we read this and we're like, oh, this is prophecy. We're supposed to read it as prophecy. And we haven't been exposed to this extra biblical material.
Yeah. So it's actually a little bit more out of place than it seems when you just read the Bible straight
Yeah.
through,
Yeah.
perhaps. Yeah.
It's a
So,
completely different genre. And we
yeah.
don't have any other examples of it that are clear in our
Yeah.
canon until the book of Revelation.
And so, like you said, Daniel's written over a long period of time.
Yeah.
This second half of Daniel, the crazy part,
Yeah.
is written, or at least presumably written later than the first part.
Yeah.
But we're told that Daniel is the one receiving these visions, right? We say Daniel. It literally says Daniel receives vision.
Yes, yes. And
One
it
of
says,
them, I
I,
think.
Daniel, saw. Yeah.
Yes, right. And so, how do you think through that? If it's written way later, do we think Daniel really got these
Yeah.
visions, or
Yeah.
is this the later authors attributing their vision to Daniel, or something else?
So this is one of those genre questions, because one of the repeated features that occurs in essentially every apocalypse that's written in that 600 years is that the visions are attributed to a significant character who lives at a significant crisis point in Israel's
Right.
history.
The same would be
So
true of Revelation. It says, "I,
that's
John,
right.
saw this."
That's
Right.
right. So,
Same
and
thing.
Revelation is actually a little bit like, might actually be written by John, who's living at
Sure.
this crisis point. So that would be, if it is, and I'm not up to date on my compositional theories of Revelation, but that might be the exception. But the other apocalypses are written by Enoch. So Enoch is the character who lives immediately before the flood, which is a significant crisis point.
Uh-huh.
Ezra, who is the character that lives at the time of the rebuilding of the temple. So this is a significant crisis point. Baruch, who's Jeremiah's scribe. So he lives at the time of exile. And Daniel. Daniel
Hmm.
is the character who also lives at this cusp of exile. And so we see that these famous characters from Israel's past are the ones that are used literarily to voice this revelation concerning the pattern of time. And apocalypses often outline this pattern as a series of crisis points. So you see Enoch, who lived right before the flood, and he's predicting or outlining these various crises that are going to take place
Hmm.
before the kingdom of God comes and the righteous are vindicated. Daniel, who lived in the exile, is articulating this series of crisis points that are going to emerge before the kingdom of God comes. And so we see this is a pattern which suggests the possibility that it could be a rhetorical device native to the genre, if that makes
Meaning,
sense.
yeah.
Yes,
Say that. Say
meaning,
that in other words.
so this could be something that if you were going to sit down and write an apocalypse, one
Hmm.
of the features of the template would be to pick a famous person from Israel's past who
Sure.
lived at a crisis point to be the spokesperson. The kind of silly modern example that I use is something like Hamilton. So
Hmm.
Hamilton is, we had composers and they put words in the mouths of significant historical figures from
Right.
American history. These historical figures, they do some things that are historically actual, but the words that they speak are words that were applicable in their time, but also speak into the present moment. And
Yep.
we understand that because it's helping us to see a pattern. It's helping us to see something about, in Hamilton's case, the nature of America that was
Hmm.
true back in Hamilton's time and that we've maybe forgotten now. And so to put these apocalyptic visions in the mouth of Daniel, who survived and thrived under the exile of the king Nebuchadnezzar, is comfort to people living under the regime of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. To
Right.
say, wait, this has happened before. We've seen a king who was all powerful, the head of gold. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar, he's like the paradigmatic defeating king who destroyed the Jerusalem temple, and he fell. And guess what? Daniel lived in the reign of Cyrus. And Cyrus was a bit better than Nebuchadnezzar, right? Like he let the temple be rebuilt and he fell. And so now that we're living under the reign of this king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who seems more powerful than any emperor ever has before, guess what? He might
Yeah.
fall as well. And the evidence, and let me be clear, because I think this also gets confusing. The evidence for this is not some kind of a priori assumption that Daniel couldn't have told the future. So we're not looking at this and saying,
Hmm.
well, he's, accurately narrating Hellenistic history. That's impossible. The reason that we're claiming that maybe this is something that actually happened is we have tons of examples of this genre from the ancient world in which they do this repeatedly.
Sure. Yeah. So we're not saying we don't believe Daniel could have
No,
foretold the future.
no,
It just doesn't quite fit based on the surrounding evidence. Yeah.
that's right. That's right.
Yep.
I
Yep.
share the presuppositions of those ancient diviners that God can
Right.
indeed tell you the future if
Yeah.
God so decides. But the question is, did God decide to do it that way in this particular case? Or is God using a familiar genre from the ancient world in order to convey a
Yeah.
truth that extends from the past, into our present? So,
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. I do like, I think that's a good um, reminder because I think, at least in my opinion, a faithful reading of the Bible does require at least an openness to
yeah.
prophecy. It certainly seems to be happening, and
Yeah.
I certainly, as a reader, seem to be encouraged to believe that it's true.
Yeah.
I don't want to think the text is trying to trick me into thinking they
Yeah.
got it right by accident, right? So,
Yeah.
um, totally agree. And you're saying, so then to wrap up our crazy segment on
Sure.
apocalypse, you're saying then for these later period Israelites who are still in exile in the Greek period, which is getting what's the time period you're seeing for this?
So this would be the at least 8 through 12 for sure would
Yep.
be probably sometime between 167 and 164
Yeah.
BCE.
So we're 400 years after Daniel actually lived.
Absolutely.
And
Yes.
you're
Yes.
seeing those
In Jerusalem. They're
Israelites.
probably back in
Yep.
Jerusalem.
Okay.
But Jerusalem is under the Seleucid regime. So they're not an independent nation state and they're
Yep.
suffering under the reign of Antiochus
And
IV.
you're seeing those people,
That's right.
oppressed people, looking back to the story of Daniel
Exactly.
and getting encouraged.
Exactly. And Daniel 7 through 12 is revelation from God. They're receiving new revelation from God,
Yeah.
voiced in this particular genre. And
Yep.
the pattern that is revealed is not only a pattern from their vantage point of the future, then, right? They're being encouraged to look at the past in a particular way, to see a pattern of divine activity where God is the one who's both raising up and destroying these
Yeah.
Gentile empires. And if they see that pattern in the past, and that's revelation, right? That's information that you can't always tell from the outside. Um, then it's something that God could do in the present.
Yeah. So in that way, they are kind of like the prophets in the sense that you're
Yeah.
looking back, but in a
Yes.
slightly different way.
Yes. Yes. But not in the we're very yeah. I think we think prediction, specific prediction. I think we're too impressed with prediction. We should assume that God can predict the future. And the
Yep.
question is, what information is God giving us? And what is the wisdom that's contained in it that allows us to live as faithful in this present moment in time?
Okay. enough craziness. We'll go to the fun stuff next. The lion's den and the fire furnace.
That's pretty crazy too. It's just in a different way.
It is. Okay, so now to the stuff that everyone I think is most familiar with.
Yes.
As well as a part that I forgot was in Daniel, which is the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. For some reason, I think it's easy to forget where that is in the Bible. It doesn't, Daniel's funny. You get Daniel, his story, and then all of a sudden you get the fire furnace, and then we're back to Daniel getting visions. So it's kind of funny in that way.
Yeah. And by the way, this is probably reflecting the history of composition. They probably didn't circulate initially as like a group of stories. It probably was the way that we often encounter them as children, right? Like, let me tell you the story of the fiery furnace.
Yeah.
One kind of silly story. And then it got connected to these Daniel stories. And now as a unit, but it doesn't have to be. You can just tell the story of the fiery furnace by itself. It's a great story.
Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting note too.
Yeah.
So now to switch gears back to our 1 through 6, we're no longer in apocalypse. Now, are we in kind of a more typical biblical history type of read? Am I supposed to read Daniel 1 to 6 kind of relatively plainly, like Daniel 1 when Daniel and his friends become vegetarians, and yet they grow very strong? How do you read a story like that? Because we have all these miracles, whether it's the lion's den, the fire furnace, you have these truly miraculous, like you said, even for a kid, it's kind of like Jonah. I think these are like super memorable stories, like VeggieTale stories that they use.
Yes. Yes.
They're like perfect. They're perfect fodder for that.
They're so
and they're fun to read. So I'm curious just how you conceptualize those and how you think about them.
Yeah. So I do read them plainly, but I read them plainly as what they are, which are court tales, which is again it's a very formulaic genre. So what does this mean to me? It seems to us, from a study of each of these stories, that for many of them, there is what we might call a historic inspiration, an episode in the lives of some Judean exiles that preserves a memory, a core of some remarkable event that occurred. Some of them are in Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Some of them are probably related to a king called Nabonidus, who's a much lesser known Babylonian king. And the way that we see this is if you look at some of the features of the story. So for instance, in Daniel 3, Nabonidus was a king who initiated the worship of a new god, Sin. Well, not a new god. Sin already existed, but he made him the head of the pantheon, unseated Marduk, essentially. And one of the things that Nabonidus did was build this cult statue of Sin and moved it from Babylon to the temple in Haran, where he was going to take up residence, this deity. And so we and many scholars say, okay, Daniel 3 might be remembering this event, but then formulating that event in the parameters of a familiar story model. So we're familiar with story models today, right? We have, you've got like the romantic comedy model where, there's a meet cute and then there's some kind of relational tension and then they get together in the end. And this is both something that we can use for purely fictional stories. You can make up a rom-com, but it's also a way that we often end up telling our own stories that are historical, because those patterns are in our mind. So like when you're like, tell me about your relationship, you have in your mind, well, there's when we met, right? Maybe there's some turmoil that we went through, maybe not. And then there's like the moment when we realized we loved each other. And then the moment we got married. Yes. And that's how you tell your romantic stories. That's totally cultural. That's totally culturally determined. And so there can be things that both have a historical strand to them, but are also cast into these story forms that actually determine the way that we see these stories. And with something like Daniel 1 through 6, which were clearly popular stories told over and over again over a long period of time, we can see patterns of embellishment is the wrong word, but maybe like embellishment, translation, the addition of new elements that made this story, that probably preserves a historical memory, that clarifies its message in each period of time.
Hmm.
Can I give one example from Daniel
Yeah,
3?
please.
Because this is something that we don't catch in English translation, but anyone reading the story in Aramaic, it would be one of the most obvious features. So in Daniel 3 is kind of a funny story. Um, but one of the things that we have is those repeated lists. So let me just read. Uh, this is Daniel 3, just in case you don't remember. So King Nebuchadnezzar made a golden statue whose height was 60 cubits and whose width was 60 cubits. He set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent for the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces to assemble and come to the dedication of the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the province assembled for the dedication of the statue. And then a couple of verses later, you are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, drum, and entire musical ensemble, and this is repeated several times. And you can
Yeah.
just imagine that this is part of the energy of the storytelling, right? We don't
Yep.
actually have missives from Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus that are like listing every single kind of governor and every single kind of instrument. This is clearly kind of fun embellishment. You can picture a
Interesting.
storyteller just listing these one after another in
Yeah,
order
and
to
it
get
comes
the
out
kids
more when
riled
you
up.
read it.
Yeah,
I think
totally.
when you say it out loud, when you read it,
Totally.
I think you see it. You see it, skip, or you're just reading
Right.
quickly.
You
It's
just
like whatever.
exactly.
Yeah.
Um, but if you look at it in Aramaic, something else that's interesting about these lists is the lists are made up of loan words from other languages. And each list is made up of majority loan words from a particular language. So let me give an example. So that first list, the satraps, prefects, governors, etc., that is majority Persian loan words. So it's if you were reading it, it would sound foreign, right? I'm trying to think of loanwords in English. This is so
Like a rendezvous, maybe.
yeah. So if you're like, we have to rendezvous and responde s'il vous plaît and
Right.
you
Right.
you would hear it. You'd be like, wait, especially if you did it again and again and again and again.
Yeah, in
Because
a
we have
list.
loan words that have become part of our language, but you'd be like, oh, you're making some kind of comment about the French.
Right.
Then the musical instruments are majority Greek loan words. And it's really noticeable because I think you mentioned you'll be taking Hebrew. Hebrew has a very kind of set structure, and this is Aramaic, which is very similar to Hebrew. One of the little tips is if you add Aramaic to your Hebrew, you can say you know two languages, and they're very similar to each other. Little professional tip. But these are, with the exception of the horn, are not familiar Semitic roots. They're very clearly loanwords and they're majority Greek.
Interesting.
Later on, one final list that we get is the list of the clothing that they wear when they're thrown into the fire. Let's see. I'm just reading the NRSV. It says their tunics, their trousers, their hats, and their other garments. These are loanwords from Scythian, which is a distinctive mode of dress that the Persians borrowed from their neighbors, the Scythian. It became very fashionable in Persian time periods. So we have these guys, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're dressed like Scythians, which is like a very distinctive mode of dress. You would not expect it. And it specifies in the text that way. They are gathered with Persian officials listening to Greek instruments. Yes.
Even
These are
though they're in
in
this is closer to Daniel from
exactly,
570 BC.
exactly, even though it's
Yeah.
set in the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. So
Interesting.
you see this fun literary detail that's actually hinting at the truth that we just heard in Daniel 2, which is that we got the head of gold,
Uh,
it's Babylon, and then we're going to have Persia, and then we're going to have Media, and
yeah.
then we're going to have
Some
Greece.
things some things never change.
So Nebuchadnezzar is actually worshiping his statue to the tune of an empire that's going to take him over.
Oh,
And
interesting.
right? So this isn't historical, right? This isn't saying, and in Babylon, they mostly listen to Greek instruments, right? This is a
Right.
little hidden code that would help the audience enjoy this story, right? You can just imagine them kind of chuckling.
Yeah.
It's a literary feature that conveys a message. That conveys a
Yeah.
message at
So
Nebuchadnezzar's
this would be
expense.
I want to stick
Yeah.
on this point. This is so
Yeah.
interesting. And especially the clothing I think is like a dead
Isn't that
giveaway.
funny? Yes.
This would
It's
be
so
like
funny.
I'm trying to think of an analogy. It would be like if you were say you were writing a story and you were trying to argue against consumerism or
Yeah.
materialism,
Yeah.
it would be like putting George Washington in Air Jordans,
Yes.
correct?
Yes, totally.
Yes, right?
Totally.
So
Exactly.
as soon as you
Exactly.
hear that, but when you
Exactly.
translate it,
Yep.
then it all looks the same.
That's
So
right.
in the English, you lose that.
That's right. John
But if
Adams
you
is coming
heard,
along with like an electric guitar and
right,
like
right,
it's funny and it's saying something and it's
yeah,
saying something true, but it isn't history because that isn't what it is.
right,
It's a
interesting.
fun, funny court tale genre. And again, we're not making this decision based off of like, well, of course they couldn't get rescued from the flames. We're
Sure.
making this decision based off of like, okay, what literary techniques do we see here um, in the story? And that's a pattern that I think we see. So I think we have historical episodes behind most of these stories that we can discern. Um, but the stories themselves are not designed to be history. Like back in 555 BCE, this happened. They're designed to be stories that travel across time, that are paradigms, not only for how Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego lived in Babylon and how God rescued them in this moment. They're meant to be patterns that inspire faithful behavior, both
Mm.
in situations where God does miraculously rescue and when God doesn't. And that's the point of Daniel 3, when they say, yeah, our God can rescue. And even if God doesn't matter, right? Whether God rescues or not, we are going to be faithful even to the point of death. And so these really entertaining stories are designed to promote that stance.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so fascinating. I love the examples are very helpful.
Yeah,
And I appreciate your articulation too of not dismissing it on the grounds of it being improbable,
totally.
but
Right.
saying, listen, I'm just trying to read it
Exactly.
faithfully as was written down.
Exactly.
Not because, like you said it well, it's not that they couldn't survive the fiery
Yeah.
furnace. In fact, I think the story is trying to invite the reader to say, look, God could really do this.
Yeah.
Like believe and be
Yeah.
encouraged that this could
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
It's similar. I think I've been doing work on Jonah. I get the
Yeah.
same impression from Jonah.
Yeah.
When you
Totally.
read that book, it seems to really be trying to give you the impression that this could really happen,
Yeah.
that God could do it.
Sure.
And then it almost, the question of whether it actually happened fades a little bit.
Totally.
Because if it could happen and it could happen again, that's really the point, that God has the power to do that.
Yeah.
Just like how, and then you pair that with, I'm getting on a tangent now, but you pair it with something like Jesus calming the storm.
That's right.
You say, look,
That's right.
God clearly has the power to control the weather and
That's right.
nature and things. And
Totally.
so then your question of what is it trying to teach us? What is it trying to teach me through time is actually more important.
And I think it can lead us, because the point, it can lead us to sometimes miss the message, because the point of Daniel 3 is not God will rescue you from the fiery furnace. It totally isn't, especially if you think about the historical transmission of Daniel, where Daniel is read to a group of people who saw the Jerusalem temple burn, who lost family members in the siege of Jerusalem, and God did not intervene. It's also written for those who saw Cyrus miraculously decide to send the exiles back to Jerusalem with the supplies to build the temple. It's also written to those who are suffering under Antiochus IV Epiphanes and aren't seeing God save everybody, as it's written for us today, where we see the same thing. Right? There are times when God acts miraculously to heal, to provide, to bring life, to direct, to make
Yep.
God's will clear. And then there are times when God does not heal or rescue, where God doesn't provide in the ways that we want him to provide. Yes? And so Daniel 3 is a story that's written for all of those time periods, to say God can do this, but also God is there in Babylon, clearly, the fourth person in the fire. And even if God doesn't, God is still worthy of our loyalty and worship. And so it's actually a story that works for both contexts, which is just so nuanced and true and
Yeah.
affirmed in the rest of Scripture. Yes, so
Yeah. And great.
yeah.
I mean, it's good news, right? Still
Good
for us today.
news.
It's awesome.
Oh, totally. Yeah, good
Well,
news.
we're unfortunately running out of time, and I've been promising that we would at least talk about the Lion's Den
Yeah.
a little bit. So as we close, could you give us maybe a note or two that you've in your research come across that changes how you read that story or that you just think is interesting?
Yeah, yeah. Daniel 6 is really interesting. It is, so I think some of the, there's lots to say. There's lots to say. One of the things that I think is maybe the most enjoyable or clever about the story that we don't catch once again in translation is there's this phrase in Aramaic that describes uh it's used when you're making false criticisms of somebody, when you're starting a rumor in order to negatively impact somebody, and quite literally in Aramaic. Here, let me find it in Daniel 6. I'm going to get the actual, and here I'm using the
Yeah, perfect.
NRSV. So verse 24 or 25 in English. 24 in English. Okay. So it's this in 624. It's 25 in the Aramaic, but 24 in English. It says, the king gave a command, and those who had accused Daniel were brought and thrown into the den of lions. In Aramaic, this is an idiom that's literally, woodenly, 8 pieces of. And it's an
Hmm.
idiom that's used to describe someone denouncing or falsely accusing someone. You'd say they would eat pieces of this person. And so in Aramaic, what actually happens in the story is they eat pieces of Daniel or attempt to eat pieces of Daniel. And in response, they themselves are eaten. And so it's a
Hmm.
very clear lex talionis type of punishment where measure for measure, the thing that they do is the same way in which they're punished. And this, once
Hmm.
again, is one of those kind of clever reversals of fortune that the original audience would have appreciated and gotten. It's kind of an inside joke, but that we lose in translation.
Hmm.
It's also the case that in books like the Psalms, and in ancient laments about unfair colleagues, we see enemies portrayed as lions. They're opening their mouths, their teeth, they are roaring against me, attempting to
Yeah.
devour me. This is language that we're familiar with from the Psalms. And so here too, there might be a literary purpose to the idea that Daniel is thrown into a den of lions. There's kind of this beautiful artistry that is suggesting that the lions that these people are encountering, both in terms of political rivalry, because keep in
Yep.
mind, these are an ethnic minority in the court of the king. This is going to be a position where they find themselves as outsiders, both sometimes based on religious practice, also based on language, also based on social networks. So, this idea that there are these people who have power over against them, who are attempting to denounce them, who are attempting to devour them, in the words of the Psalms and in this Aramaic idiom, that God has the ability to turn their fate around, that God in
Yeah.
the end will be the one who vindicates you, even in these situations where you're perceiving very little power. And this is good news for people who are in a position of political weakness and social isolation, a minority status in their social culture. And I think this is something that really resonates with people who are living as minorities in any
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah. So to say, just to rehash to make sure I got it, to to tear someone down, to spread false rumors, I
That's
would
right.
say I'm eating that person.
You're
I'm
eating their
taking bites
pieces.
out of the person.
I'm
Yeah.
eating pieces of
Okay.
that person. Exactly.
So
Exactly.
so their punishment for that is getting eaten by
They
lions.
got devoured.
Yeah.
Yes,
It's funny,
immediately.
right? When you
It's
say it that way, it's
funny.
immediately funny.
It's
Yeah.
funny. And so you're getting a sense of the artistry. I mean,
Right.
Daniel is one of the most like punny books
Yeah.
because it's written by probably a bunch of court scholars, right? So it's like
Yeah.
it's kind of a
Interesting.
nerdy book. It has
Hmm.
all this wordplay and symbolism, and it just adds to the enjoyment of this story. So it's these
Yeah.
timeless themes, but it's presented in this humorous, interesting, captivating, clever way.
Yeah. I think the coolest thing about I suppose the whole Bible, but particularly the Old Testament, is when you get those glimpses of
Oh, yeah.
artistry
Totally.
without abandoning the history of it.
Yeah.
And you get both. And when you get to have both and you get to read it both ways, I think it's really brilliant.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
just super, super cool. You just have to learn Aramaic and then you can find
Yeah.
it. Right. Piece of cake.
Piece of cake.
Right.
Piece of cake. Seriously, though, if you learn Hebrew, Aramaic is so similar to Hebrew. So similar to Hebrew and very, very interesting. So.
Can't wait. Well, Dr. Buster, thanks so much. This has been a really fun conversation.
Yeah.
It's exactly what I wanted. I think revealing things about Daniel that the average reader would never know, but which as soon as you point it out, you think, I can't believe I'm reading it, without these things. It's super cool to learn. I appreciate your time with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for your questions, Will. It's been so fun talking about this. I mean, I could talk about Daniel all day. It's endlessly fascinating, and I'm glad to share it with you and whoever's listening and watching.
Great. Thanks.